On behalf of my staff and all of us here, welcome to the fourth of our fall Vice Admiral and Mrs. Shifley lecture series presented by the generosity of the class of 1950. And I'd like to acknowledge that we have a member of the class of 1950 with us, Captain Ross. Sir, welcome. We always enjoy having you guys. Always enjoy having you guys here to watch us spend your money. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Steve Malone, who works in the economics department, and he's going to introduce today's speaker.
Hi, my name is Steve Malone. I'm an adjunct in economics where I teach a course that introduces the MIDs to the tools of how to analytically figure out what you're going to invest in, and then once you decide what you're going to invest in, how to manage that project completion. A couple of years ago, I listened to Captain Schneider, our speaker today, over the Annapolis Maritime Museum, talk about the use of what we call today modern manufacturing techniques in making these wonderful ships. Things like just-in-time, central planning, reusable design, etc. And Captain Schneider graciously agreed to come to my class, which he's done now for several years, to talk to him about this. And the MIDs are fascinated by the story of manufacturing only 30 miles from here. Captain Schneider also has agreed to guest lecture in the mathematics department in a course of cost estimating. Captain Schneider himself has graduated from the Merchant Marine Academy. After graduation, he embarked on the 24-year career in the U.S. Navy, where he was aboard submarines, surface vessels, and in command of the frigate, the Robert E. Perry. After retirement from the Navy, he became involved for the next 30 years in a nonprofit organization that owns and maintains this wonderful ship. One of their 2 Liberty ships still afloat. And I think we should welcome him. He's going to tell us a story about the John W. Brown.
Steve, thank you. Good afternoon. Let me tell you right off the bat, it's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy talking about Liberty ships, and particularly John W. Brown. Time is relatively short. I'll get started without further ado. This is a Liberty ship, John W. Brown. I'm going to talk about the emergency shipbuilding program in World War II that was run by the Maritime Commission, which would build more than 5,500 commercial ships for use during the wartime. The most significant proportion of those ships were Liberty ships. And in this context, the word Liberty refers to a specific design of ship, like Arleigh Burke when you talk about the DDG-51s. So this is a Liberty ship. This one is still afloat and operating up in Baltimore. The ship is 441 feet long, a beam of 57 feet. It carried about 10,000 tons of cargo, which was about par for the course beginning of the war. Traveled at a speed of 10 knots, which by today's standards is somewhat slow, but convoy speed in the Atlantic at the beginning of the war was only 8 knots, so a 10-knot ship did just fine. It had a crew of 44 civilian merchant mariners operating the ship. And then you can see that there's defensive armament on the ship. When they put the armament on, they put a Navy contingent on called the Naval Armed Guard. It was generally headed up by a junior officer, an ensign or a JG, and on the case of John W. Brown, which had a total of 12 guns eventually, generally 30 to 40 enlisted, couple of gunner's mates, and a number of seamen first class. So we're going to talk about the emergency shipbuilding program that built Liberty ships. Battle of the Atlantic, I don't have to talk very much about that. I am sure you're all familiar with it. The longest battle of World War II began on the 3rd of September, 1939, with the sinking of the British liner Athenia off the coast of Ireland. And the last ship sunk by a German submarine was the American flag ship. It was a collier that was sunk off the coast of Rhode Island on the 5th of May. The German goal with their submarine command was to sink many more ships than the Allies could manufacture, could replace, and particularly to starve England into submission and also prevent war materials from being transported to Murmansk. So it was the Battle of the Atlantic, the submarine campaign, which brought about the need for a significant shipbuilding program. This is U.S. flag SS Tiger, not a very dramatic photograph of a ship being sunk, but I use this photograph because this ship was sunk as it approached the pilot station to pick up a pilot at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. That's how close the German submarines were operating to our coast. The first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank almost 200 American flagships off the East Coast, Gulf Coast, and in the Caribbean. They had a real heyday over here. Backing up a bit, the Brits, who have been in this war since 1939, could not produce merchant ships quickly enough to replace what they were losing to German submarines. In 1940, they sent a shipbuilding delegation to the United States headed by one Cyril Thompson. His task was to find a way to build 60 merchant ships, like these two ocean-class ships shown in the view graph, in the United States. He quickly found out that the United States was already gearing up for likely entry into the war. All our shipbuilding facilities were tied up, most of them building naval tonnage. And so he said, he was told, facilities are simply not available, you'll have to go elsewhere. He persevered. He got together with the industrialist, Henry J. Kaiser, and a couple of people who ran shipyards, and he was told that if Britain built the shipyards in this country, they could build the ships in this country, and that's what they did. They built a shipyard in South Portland, Maine. They built one on the West Coast, and each of those yards built 20 of these ocean-class ships. At the same time, or shortly thereafter, the Maritime Commission recognizes that we're going to be in this war shortly, and we're going to need a lot of merchant tonnage to haul the materials of war wherever they're needed. And so they embarked on what they would eventually be called an emergency shipbuilding program to do this. So the initial question they were faced with is, do we build an existing class of ship that we've already started, or do we build something that is more quickly assembled? The Merchant Marine Act of 1936 had started to rebuild the American merchant marine. They'd come up with designs for several classes of cargo ships that were essentially state-of-the-art. They had sea speeds of 15 to 17 knots. They were powered by steam turbines. It took a while to build these ships. They weren't quickly produced. The other alternative, which I'll call the wartime expedient, was to take this design of a British Depression-era tramp steamer, make some changes to Americanize it and to make it more quickly built, and go ahead and build this wartime expedient. After much discussion, they opted for the latter course of action. So they got the plans for these British tramp steamers from the Brits. They gave them to Gibbs & Cox, who was at the time our foremost naval architect, and they made some changes to these ships so that they would be more habitable for American crews. The British ships were coal-fired because the Brits hung on to coal-fired ships for a long time. We had already converted to oil, so they did away with the coal-fired Scotch boilers and put in oil fires, oil furnaces, and they made some other changes which made these ships so they could be more quickly built almost on an assembly line process. Before that, ships had been pretty much built one at a time. The other change they made was that the Brits generally gave a shipyard very general plans and let the individual shipyards use them to discretions on how they implemented those general plans. Maritime Commission's direction to Gibbs & Cox was, you make detailed plans. We want to know everything. And those detailed plans were given to the 18 shipyards that would eventually build Liberty ships. And so they were all essentially cookie cutters. They were the parts were very much interchangeable. A big boon for John W. Brown when we started restoring it, because we could go to the reserve fleet, and if there was a Liberty ship down there, we could take any part and it would fit in John W. Brown. The whole patterns, the pipe size, everything was the same. It also made a lot of difference in the assembly of these ships because Steve mentioned this idea of just-in-time delivery. And so you had a number of contractors building pumps or building different things that would go on the ship. And if one of them couldn't deliver in time, you could get the same piece of machinery from another vendor or one of its competitors, and it was going to fit and it was going to work. This is what they ended up with. It's a basic 5-hatch dry cargo ship with cargo booms. You can see on the drawing that there is armament, so the ship was configured to have defensive armament, and most of our merchant ships during World War II did have defensive armament. Those of you not familiar with merchant ships, I'm going to point out this term, double bottom tanks. This is the area between the outer bottom and the inner bottom. I'm going to refer to that on a later view graph, but just wanted you to be aware of what it was and where it fit on the ship. Again, 441 feet long, carried about 10,000 tons of cargo, crew of 44 merchant mariners. So, Maritime Commission had come up with the ship design. This was the engine that was going to be used. This is a triple expansion reciprocating steam engine. It was used in the, I don't mean to keep standing in front of you. You need to yell at me when I do that. Used in the British design. The engine was obsolete well before World War II. I'll take you back to 1912 when they built Titanic. Titanic had 2 triple expansion engines, larger than this, but nevertheless 2 triple expansion engines, same basic design, on their wing propellers. Their centerline shaft had a Parsons cruising turbine. Point being that in 1912, the steam turbine had already been introduced and would very quickly prove itself to be the most efficient way to propel a steamship. Turbines weren't available. As you can appreciate, it took a rather sophisticated machine shop and manufacturing effort to build them. They weren't available for the merchant ships. They got the reciprocating steam engines. I can tell you they are a pleasure to work on. They are fascinating to watch them in motion, and they're a durable engine, and the one on John W. Brown continues to run. Okay, we've got the ships. Now, just as Cyril Thompson found out when he was trying to build ships here, there were no shipyard space available for building the merchant ships. So the Maritime Commission had to build the shipyards, just the same way Thompson did. They would eventually build 18 shipyards on all 3 coasts, Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf, to build Liberty ships. This is a picture of the Bethlehem Fairfield yard where John W. Brown was built. Bethlehem Fairfield yard being in the area right where the toll booth to the harbor tunnel is now, up in Baltimore. They started out with 13 building ways. They ended up at the end of the war with 16 building ways. They built a lot of Liberty ships as well as some other ships. So if you're starting up a shipyard, manpower becomes, and manpower is the wrong word now. We got to use female power or just labor power. Men were in short supply. They recruited a number of women. By the end of the war, the number of women in the shipyard workforce was over 15%. So they did, as you can see, being trained on electrical circuitry here, they did a lot of welding. They were very good welders. Picture of Bethlehem Fairfield workers as they finished the fitting out of their 10th ship. This is Bethlehem Fairfield's wartime record. Local shipyard, 384 Liberty ships over 4 years. Do the math. That's a lot of Liberty ships. The number should say 94 on the Victories. Victory was the follow-on design to the Liberty ship. Had a finer underwater hull lines, and by that time steam turbines were available, so the Victories were fitted with either a 6,000 horsepower or an 8,500 horsepower steam turbine. And when I had the picture of the reciprocating engine up there, I did not mention, and I will now, it developed a whopping 2,500 horsepower. Not very much for an engine trying to push 14,000 tons of displacement through the water. So Bethlehem Fairfield had quite a production record during the war. And they approached production almost in an assembly line manner, which allowed them to achieve some significant efficiencies. One of the big changes is that these ships were almost all welded. Bethlehem Fairfield did some riveting as well as welding, but most of the shipyards, the Liberty ships, were all welded. Prior to that time, only a handful of ships had been welded. Shipbuilders had stuck with riveting up through the interwar years. So there were a lot of reservations about welding and use of welding on ships. Second thing, there was a great deal of prefabrication done. In the background here are double bottom tanks. These are these tanks that go on the bottom of a merchant ship. They're about 3.5 feet high, and you can see they're assembled and stacked 3 high behind the female welder here who is building more. So great deal of prefabrication was done. The other thing, when you think about it, here's Bethlehem Fairfield, a brand new yard set up so it could be built to facilitate just the particular type they were building, and the workforce had to be trained in a single ship. Or if you're an electrician, you were doing electrical circuits on only a Liberty ship. You didn't have to learn any other ships. And every time you went to work, you were going to be working on the same kind of platform. And there was some efficiency to be gained there. The other thing that contributed to this is that on the Liberty ship program, there were no significant design changes. As we watch Navy construction, we will watch classes of ships be built, and then technology advances, and there are changes which we want to backfit, so we have flights 1, flight 2, flight 3, as there are slight changes in these ships. That didn't happen in the Liberty ships. They were all the same design. No design changes. Prefabrication shows a bow section being put on the, mated to the rest of the ship on the building ways. The size of the prefabricated portions were limited only by the size of the crane that was available at the building way. So on these shipyards building Liberty ships, they had a large assembly area where they did a lot of prefabrication, and large pieces of ship came to the building ways to be assembled. This is a section of the midships house of a Liberty ship. It's about 1/3 of the full midships house. And it's complete. The doors are in, the port lights are in. You can see bulkhead mounted fans. The lifeboat davits are on the side. The railings are on the top. It's painted. Where the electrical wiring has to be mated to the adjacent section, when that comes along, the wire is coiled up, ready to be run. So the prefabrication, when it was delivered to the building ways, was essentially complete. It did not even need painting. This is Patrick Henry, the first Liberty ship launched. It was launched on the 27th of September, 1941 at the Bethlehem Fairfield yard. So the #1 Liberty ship goes in the water about 10 weeks before the United States is in World War II. That day, the 27th of September, 1941, was proclaimed as Liberty Fleet Day by President Roosevelt. And on that day, around the country, 14 commercial ships were launched at different shipyards, including the first 3 Liberties from 3 different shipyards. Less than a year later, Annie Green applies the champagne to the stem of John W. Brown, and John W. Brown goes down the ways September 7th, 1942, at the Bethlehem Fairfield yard. Bethlehem Fairfield launched 3 Liberty ships that day, and it was Labor Day, so the launching ceremonies included a significant portion of tribute to the labor unions, because the shipbuilding industry obviously wanted the labor unions to support this shipbuilding effort to the best of their ability and minimize the chance for strikes during the building. John W. Brown is named for a labor executive who had died the previous year. It's not the abolitionist. Interesting sidelight on this, that the week prior to launch, that hull was named Ralph Izard. For those of you from, I think, South Carolina, you'll remember that Ralph was a Revolutionary era congressman, but he had nothing to do with the labor movement. So the name was changed to John W. Brown just prior to launch. Ralph Izard's name went on a ship out of Bethlehem, Fairfield, that went down the ways about 2 weeks after John W. Brown. Once the ship was launched, it goes to the fitting out pier to have the remaining work done. I think it's obvious you want to clear the building way as quickly as you can and get the next keel laid. So again, 9 Liberty ships, all carbon copies identified just by the number on the hull. One digression here is that 7 of those 9 are Liberty tankers. I said the Liberty ships were all the same. There was an effort to minimize the, I don't want to say minimize the threat to the tankers, but to disguise petroleum carrying ships. If you're looking through a periscope or a bomb sight, it's pretty obvious when you see the profile of a tanker, and petroleum products were high priority targets for both the United States and our enemies during the war. So the building program took, I think, a total of 36 Liberties, and instead of 5 cargo hatches, they had 10 oil tanks. But they still put the cargo gear on, even though they would not carry cargo. So when you're looking at the silhouette of this ship carrying petroleum products, it looks like a cargo ship, and then perhaps it is a less valuable target than if you can find a tanker silhouette. This is a graph out of Frederick Lane's book, Ships for Victory, and it shows the average construction time of Liberty ships during the war. Time on the axis here, and then by months along the bottom. You can see that early 1942 takes about 8 months to build a Liberty ship. This is the first ship being produced by these yards. And remember also that the yards are still being built while they're building the ships. So they didn't have a very efficient building place. But look how long it took to get down to something just over 50 days. In a year's time, they're down to just over 50 days. Oh, and for those of the light shading indicates days on the building ways, and on the top, the darker shading indicates days in the days at a fitting out pier. You look at the peak of production for Liberty ships in the latter part of 1943. 40 days, keel laying to delivery. It's about 500,000 labor hours. About $1.75 million in then year dollars. And so you look at this graph and say, well, what happens after 43 when you're doing so well? Shipyards got asked to build other kinds of ships, so they were no longer building just Liberty ships. You were adding the Victory ships, you were adding the LSTs, you were adding a variety of other things. So the efficiency decreased a little bit. This shows the manpower in the Maritime Commission shipyards. Remember, these are the 18 shipyards that started out building Liberty ships. They were put together early in started being put together early in 1941, built up quickly and ramped down just as quickly at the end of the war. None of the Maritime Commission shipyards lasted into commercial business very long after the war. The record production time for a Liberty ship during World War II was launch in 4 days and 15 hours after keel laying, 3 days to fit it out, total building time 7.5 days. This is Robert E. Perry, launched by Henry J. Kaiser's Richmond, California yard. Not a sustainable rate of production. But what a propaganda feat, both for Americans on the home front and for the enemy to digest on how fast we could build ships. Think about that, particularly you younger people in camouflage outfits today. No cell phones, no computers. That's phenomenal to me. merchant mariners during the war, and still, sign on for a voyage at a time. They don't have a lot of loyalty to a ship. So at the beginning of the voyage, the shipping commissioner comes down, the crew signs articles, which is essentially a contract which says, I'm going to sail this ship for this voyage. During the war years, voyages were not well defined because you never knew where the ship was going to end up. But consequently, there was not a great deal of loyalty and not a lot of effort on the part of crew members to maintain a ship. This is a picture of John W. Brown after voyage number 3, and you can see that she has been run hard and not getting a lot of maintenance. 229 liberties were lost during the war. There was a total of almost 800 American flag merchant ships lost during the war, but 229 liberties, all causes. Most of those were lost due to combat action, most of them due to submarines, and most of them in the Atlantic. This is the Liberty ship Charles Morgan. The location is off Utah Beach, the 10th of June, 1944. Again, not a dramatic photo of a ship sinking, but I like it because it has been sunk because it was bombed by a German aircraft who bombed the after portion of it. After 2 cargo holds in the shaft alley flooded, the ship is resting on the bottom, but the flag is flying, the engineering plant is operating by the smoke, cargo gear forward is working the cargo in the undamaged forward portion of the ship. Merchant ships were defensively armed during World War II. They traveled in convoys. This is Bedford Basin in Halifax Harbor. At the beginning of the war, the fast transatlantic convoys, fast being 8 knots now, assembled in Halifax. Later on that would move to New York, but this is ships assembling in Bedford Basin to make up the next convoy. This is a convoy. We learned very quickly that the best way to get a convoy past a submarine barrier was to have a very broad front, very few ships in each column. Consequently, most of your Atlantic convoys would have anywhere from 11 to 15 columns and maybe only 5 or 6 ships per column. You can see the destroyer out in the front is one of the escort vessels, and this must be in 43 or 44 because it also has an air escort to it. A poor picture for which I apologize, but what it tries to show is that during convoys, Liberty ships traveled with their lifeboats rigged out. Normal stowage position, the lifeboats were inboard of the side of the hull. But when they went on a convoy, they would rig them out, so all they had to do was lower them. The cranking out of the davits would already be done. When the interior of the ship was filled, cargo was put on deck. Again, it doesn't show up very well here, but there's cargo on top of every hatch. And once they do that, they have so much deck cargo, they have to build a wooden catwalk to get from the midship accommodation to the bow so that the gunner's mates can get up to the bow to man the armament. One of the other ways that a few Liberty ships were lost was in the formation of the gooseberries off the Normandy invasion beaches. These were the artificial breakwaters. And so if a ship, including Liberty ships, had been damaged during the war so that it was probably not worth fixing, they were towed or in some cases steamed on their own power to Normandy while the beachhead was still being contested, and they were sunk in a line to form an artificial breakwater. So there were 7 Liberty ships that, including the one in the foreground, that were part of the breakwater. I was speaking to somebody here about Jeremiah O'Brien. Of the 2,710 Liberty ships that were built during the war, 2 remain operational, John W. Brown in Baltimore and Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco. Both are operated as historic ships. So you say, what are the odds those 2 ships are ever going to see each other? August of 1944, the 2 ships pass at sea about 10 miles north of the Cape Cod Canal. John W. Brown's northbound for a port visit in Halifax. Jeremiah O'Brien has just been to the 50th anniversary of the Normandy landings has gone to South Portland where she was built and is now on the way home. The two ships meet, and back to your point, what are the odds that there's a Canadian Coast Guard cutter right where I'm standing and a deck seaman with the equivalent of what I would call a Brownie box camera at the time, who grabbed that picture. So we have recorded it. Both of these ships operate as historic ships. Both are living memorials to merchant mariners, the Naval Armed Guard, and the shipyard workers that have largely gone unheralded, but did, I think, a phenomenal job in helping meet the war needs of the nation and the Allies. Just a quick sidelight on, since many of you have Navy background, the Navy took delivery of over 140 Liberty ships during the war and operated them. So they were commissioned into the U.S. Navy, they were manned by a Navy crew, and in most cases had a new name. Liberty ships were named for famous personages. But generally, they were attack cargo ships, straight cargo ships, net carriers. A lot of them were repair ships. The last Liberty ship in the United States Navy was USS Tutuila, stricken in 1971, was an internal combustion engine repair ship that serviced the amphibious force when I was in it, later serviced the mine force, and finished her years in Vietnam servicing the engines in the Brown Water Navy. John W. Brown's in Baltimore, still sailing. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for the opportunity. I thank you for your attention, and if there is time, I will be happy to answer any questions. Yes, sir.
When did they start that modular building?
The large-scale prefabrication?
Yeah, prefab.
Most of that was done in the, I can't speak to the Navy construction, but most of that was done in the Maritime Commission shipyards during the war, and it started when they were building Liberty ships, and again, you're having a single design. So most of it started then. Yes, sir.
What happens with most of these ships after the war? Do they continue? Do they get scrapped? Do they continue carrying on economic trade? What happens?
1946, the Ship Sales Act was enacted, and that provided for the disposition of the surplus cargo ships. Obviously, at that time, we were the largest merchant marine in the world. We had almost 2,500 Liberty ships alone that survived the war, plus a number of victory ships and other classes of ships. But that Ship Sales Act arranged for the sale of ships to U.S. shipping companies who had lost ships during the war, to our allies. The Greek merchant marine got 98 Liberty ships in one block purchase. And when you look at the names of the Greek ship owners, you see names like Koulakundis and Niarchos and Onassis, people who sort of made good after the war. But a number of them were just scrapped. Patrick Henry was scrapped here in Baltimore, and a number of them were sunk as artificial reefs. John W. Brown was loaned to the Board of Education, City of New York, and became a floating vocational high school for 35 years, where high school students trundled down, went up the gangway, and learned the maritime trades as a vocational high school education. Answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
How successful was the oil tanker camouflage?
You know, I think pretty good, because the almost all of them survived the war, and I haven't gone back to see if the ones that were lost due to hostile action, or whether it was grounding or collision or something else. I'm sorry, I don't have I don't have a good answer for that question.
Well, my first question today was going to be, did they build any tankers? And you answered that.
Yes, sir.
Why did they transition to the Victory ship? You had a nice platform you could crank out.
Part of it was the speed, and because of the submarine threat in the Atlantic, convoy speed was relatively slow, and there were a lot of ships left over from having been built in World War I, that could only go that fast. But when you got to the Pacific, the logistics became more difficult and the distances were greater. It would take a Liberty ship, you know, a month and a half to get across the Pacific. And so the Victory ship was, the Victory ship was the answer. And the Navy took a lot of Victory ships with the 8,500 horsepower plants, and made them attack APA, attack personnel, attack transports. So because of the speed, they could keep up with the Navy units. But they built, I think, 500 and something Victory ships, nowhere near as many as Liberty ships, but it was primarily because of the distances in the Pacific, and then the availability of steam turbines by 1943. Yes, sir, on the end.
Some of them were converted for troop transport, is that correct? And how did that work?
That is correct. John W. Brown being one of them. And what they came up with was a concept that they called the limited capacity troop transport. And they would take the forward 'tween deck, they would take this area here, and they would convert it to carry 500 troops. So they put in 500 canvas bottom bunks. They would put in a troop galley, a troop surgery, troop officers' quarters. And the idea was that you could take an entire military unit or a couple of companies worth of unit with all their logistics and all their equipment, and you could take them from A to B, and everybody arrived at the same time. John W. Brown did a lot of that on the second and third voyages, where the ship would get to the Mediterranean and just shuttle between ports. On those two wartime voyages, John W. Brown stopped at 18 ports on each of those cruises. So they got to the Mediterranean and they were shuttling fresh troops and fresh units forward as the front advanced. They were bringing prisoners of war and tired troops back.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
When and how did your organization acquire John Brown?
John W. Brown's in New York as a vocational high school in the 70s. There were some people who thought it would be a nice idea to preserve a Liberty ship and continue it operating. This was a logical choice because these students going to school on this ship, who are learning machinery repair and valve repair, are the initial ship restoration people. They are maintaining the ship. They're firing the boilers. They're operating lifeboats. They're as part of their education. So they did a hull survey, and the hull looked pretty good. The fact that it was modified as a troop ship, a limited capacity troop ship, had some real advantages for a museum ship. And so they formed an organization to try to get the ship when the Board of Education was done with it. Board of Education gave it up in 1982. It went to the James River Reserve Fleet and was neglected for about 5 years. And the problem that the organization had, the nonprofit organization had, was they could not find a pier where they could berth the ship. They couldn't find it. They looked in New York, they couldn't find it there. And in 1988, the state of Baltimore made a pier available in Baltimore. So the ship was, we acquired title to the ship. We actually have title to it. It's not on loan. We're responsible for every facet of its operation. We got title to the ship. We towed it up to Baltimore, and as I say, it took 3 years to get it running. Yes, sir, Ken.
Are there any recorded instances of victories using the armaments on the ships?
There are a number of cases where the defensive armament on a Liberty ship had shot down planes. There is one significant incident where a Liberty ship battled and sunk a German raider in the South Atlantic. This is Stephen Hopkins, was a Liberty ship. The German raider was Steer, sailing with Tannenfels as a supply ship. And while the Stephen Hopkins was sunk, it also sunk the steer. So there's a couple of examples where the armament and the gunners on a Liberty ship either shot down aircraft or in this one case sunk a German warship. That's the only case I know of where a Liberty ship sunk another ship with gunfire. Yes, sir.
My father was on one of these in the Pacific, and I was looking through his daily logbook. It's fascinating, but he said they fired the 5-inch gun one time, and it started a bunch of welds back aft, and he said they decided they weren't going to fire it. He said the torque from that was really damaging. But they had poured the bilge of his electronic supply ship, and they poured it, he said, 5 feet deep in concrete to weight it down because of light cargo. And he said it had a terrible motion, you know, being so heavy in the keel.
John W. Brown's very stiff. We carry ballast water and we carry iron ingots as ballast, and we are somewhat the same way because we don't have very much fuel at all, and we have no cargo. So, and we have that. It's a rather stiff ship, and it rolls.
He said the engines would stop in storms because the prop would come out. So that several times in storms they lost their engines because the propeller was coming out of the water too much.
How many engineers in here? Oh my gosh. The Liberty ships were fitted with a butterfly valve for just this problem. When your stern was coming out of the water, when you could feel the stern start to rise, and you thought that the engine was going to run away because there was no resistance on the propeller, there was a lever there that you could pick up and it would restrict this flow of steam. Not shut it, restrict it going to the engine, which would slow the engine down. And I have seen that used on John W. Brown when we were in a seaway off of Nova Scotia. It is a manpower intensive, and it wears you out in a hurry. It is hard. Yes, sir.
How many crossings did the Brown make?
Made 13 voyages during and immediately after the war, and I think the first 6 were made when we were still at war in Europe, and the voyages after that were made in peacetime. She made 5 voyages to Northern Europe and to the Mediterranean carrying bulk cargoes after the war to rebuild Europe, carrying grain and coal. So there was, I want to say 6 during the war, and the war in Europe ended during one of her voyages to Europe.
So that would be the normal life of a Liberty? That many voyages?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if it lasted that long, I mean, a number of them were sunk on their maiden voyage, but if it survived the war, that would probably be a reasonable number of voyages to have made. Yes, sir.
This kind of goes with the captain's question earlier, but were there any really famous or infamous incidents regarding Liberty ships in World War II besides the sinking of the Merchant Marine? Whatever. Any famous incidents?
Well, I think the most famous one, at least if you're a merchant mariner, was the Stephen Hopkins case. I don't think there were many that I would call heroic actions. There were a lot of unfortunate accidents where ships were destroyed or were lost, but no, I don't think so, other than the Stephen Hopkins. As one author said, they didn't get much attention. They just went out there and did their job and carried the cargo. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the double-bottom tanks before. What was the purpose of double-bottom tanks?
Oh, thank you very much. They carried fuel there. That was their primary place for carrying fuel, and they were not suitable for carrying cargo because of the curvature of the bilge and all the structure to build strength into the ship. So normally fuel was carried in those tanks, and you could carry 1,800 tons of fuel. So you could carry enough tons to go halfway, enough fuel to go halfway around the world. Thank you for calling me on that one. I should have mentioned. Yes?
Did shipbuilding continue at Bethlehem, Fairfield after World War II? Or?
No, none of the Maritime Commission shipyards lasted. After the war, we had a lot more ships than we needed. So victories because of their speed and their propulsion, a lot of them were used in commercial service. A smaller number of Liberties were used in commercial service, particularly outside the United States. But there were a couple of steamship companies, Kalmar, that worked out of Baltimore, and Bull Lines out of New York operated Liberties for a few years. But once once a Liberty ship was about 20 years old, the inspection requirements to remain in class, I'm talking about inspections by the American Bureau of Shipping, so that they would certify a vessel as being in class and suitable for insurance, they just became so difficult, it was just not worth it for most people. Yes?
Did many of the Liberty ships end up in the Ready Reserve Force?
Yeah.
Around the nation?
They did. There are some pictures of the Ready Reserve Fleet in the Hudson River up near Haverstraw, where you can see Victories and Liberties moored side by side. And a number of those ships were used to store surplus grain, I think, in the 1950s. So they were stored there. When we got John W. Brown out of the Reserve Fleet in 1988, there were 3 Liberties down there. On one side was a Liberty that had been operated by the Navy, USS Protector. And that was one of the 16 Liberty ships that were a maritime DuLine ship. Any DuLine ring a bell with anybody? Distant early warning line, the radar stations across Canada. 16 Liberty ships were outfitted with a big air search radar and just did slow ovals in the ocean looking for the airborne threat. So the answer to your question is there were 3 Liberty ships down there, and we were allowed to take parts from the other 2. We took the rudder off Arthur M. Huddell. Our volunteers removed the rudder while it was in the water, which was a hell of a feat. And then a Coast Guard cutter, we hung it off with chain falls, and a Coast Guard cutter brought it up. John W. Brown's rudder was so bad that it couldn't be repaired. So we have the rudder from Huddell, and we have parts from the other two Liberty ships. But yeah, they were in there for a while. When they broke ships out of the Reserve Fleet for Vietnam, they broke out Victories. I am not sure that they broke out any Liberties, and my opinion is that they did not, but I could be mistaken on it. They broke out a lot of Victories out of the Reserve Fleet.
All right, well, our midshipmen are all anxiously looking at their watches because it is time for them to go to class. So we'll get things up. Captain Schneider, thank you for an excellent class.
Thank you.